Hello and welcome to this screencast on Atlantic revolutions from 1770s through the 1870s. So this is beginning with the American Revolution. It's one of the Atlantic revolutions, and then going all the way through the 1870s, which is going to include German unification. So we're going to be looking at revolutionary events, but then also that's going to include revolutions and ideas, and then nationalism. So those are some of the big ideas that are coming up here, happening in countries that bordered the Atlantic Ocean. This is chapter 28 in Bentley and Ziegler's Traditions and Encounters, 5th edition, with a bit of a throwback to chapter 23. Let's take a look. The image that I have chosen for this slide here is Madame du Châtelet, who was a French writer, thinker, scientist, companion to the famous French, it's a tongue twister, the famous French philosophe Voltaire. She translated Isaac Newton's Principia from English into French, and as a result of that, she was part of the Enlightenment, but also a person who was important in the scientific revolution in France. So both of these changes in thinking involved a more rigorous application of logical thinking, reasoning to understanding the physical world and also understanding human affairs. The scientific revolution itself, which is discussed in chapter 23, was originally, or some of the biggest original contributions to scientific knowledge happened in the field of astronomy. But as important as any piece of knowledge that was gained during the course of the scientific revolution is a change in how scientific knowledge was constructed through the scientific method. Now, this had revolutionary implications, although it wasn't built on anything brand new in world history. So, observing the world, thinking logically about what was happening. These are things people have been doing for a long time and in a variety of places. But in the 1600s in Europe, there was sort of a series of discoveries of an overturning of accepted wisdom that is referred to as the scientific revolution in European history. The application of that kind of thinking, questioning previous ideas and testing them with logic, was something that is called the Enlightenment. Okay? The result of this in science was the Newtonian universe. And what that means is Isaac Newton's basic theories of physics, the laws of motion that many students learn early in high school or even in middle school, was a universe that could be understood with careful observation and sharp math skills, meaning that the universe was understandable if a person was careful enough and applied enough thinking to it. Okay. Now, this is eventually going to be overturned by like the Einstein's universe, where Einstein's like, well, we really can't make those kinds of absolute statements, right? Einstein's most famous theory is the theory of relativity. But for a time, the Newtonian universe was very appealing to people because it indicated that we as humans could understand our world. These challenges to received wisdom would have political implications. So, someone like John Locke would argue in the social contract that if a king is abusive to the rights of people, the people have a right to overthrow him. That's what Locke's social contract was written to justify the English Parliament inviting a Dutch nobleman, William of Orange, who was married to the king's sister, inviting him to invade England and overthrow the existing king, James II, because he said there was a social contract between rulers and ruled, and as a result of that, the people should have a choice in how they were governed. So this was, in contrast to theories of divine right. So that's the received wisdom that the king governs because the king is the king. Then it's like, well, no, the king only governs if he's protecting the rights of the governed. Voltaire would be another important thinker in this, Madame du Châtelet's companion, and he was very much in favor of freedom of expression. Now, Voltaire, it should be pointed out, was not opposed to monarchy. He hung out with some kings like Frederick the Great in Prussia, who owned serfs and was an absolute monarch, and he corresponded with Catherine the Great in Russia, who was also an absolutist, a believer in absolute power for the monarch. But he was pushing for what we would think of today as freedom of expression, freedom of press, freedom of speech, and opposed to the influence of the church. So these ideas would be, somewhat revolutionary. Within the world of economics, coming along at this same time is Adam Smith, who's introducing what we would today call economic liberalism, which is the idea that people should be free to make kind of market-based decisions economically, so that there should be fewer barriers to trade within and between countries. And so he was primarily concerned with that. And so, taken together, these ideas compose the modern ideology of liberalism: free markets and free politics and freedom of thought. So the liberalism is related to liberty in that way. You should know, whenever we talk about these late 18th and 19th century ideologies, you have to take what we use these words to mean today in American politics and kind of put them in a box and put that box underneath your bed, because the words don't mean exactly the same thing used historically as they would today. And in fact, American liberals and American conservatives are kind of two species, or two descendants, cousins, if you will, descended from 19th century liberalism. So we can talk about that another time. But just know that when you hear that word liberalism here, it's not exactly the same thing as what that word would mean in our political world today. Now, there is more to this story, and we can develop those. I've developed those thoughts in a different presentation. It's worth just noting that the Enlightenment produced all kinds of things. It didn't just produce liberal democracy, and as many people have pointed out, even that's not great in all its features. So, know that. Okay. But moving forward to the revolutions that claim to be part of the Enlightenment heritage, take a look at that. So here we see an image from the French Revolution. So that will be one of the revolutions that is important in this time period. So you see the main idea up there: nationalism, revolution, and reform, which is one of the four key concepts in the modern period. And what we're going to be looking at is here this intense period of revolution and rebellion. Okay. The American Revolution is the first one. The French Revolution, though, in a world history class, will assume a lot of importance, because France is a big country in Europe, and the ideas from the French Revolution were influenced by the American Revolution, and in turn, they influenced a lot of the other revolutionary activity that was happening, including revolutions in Haiti and in Spanish America. So, rebellion against existing governments. In the French Revolution, revolutionaries overthrew the monarch and first instituted a constitutional monarchy, and then abolished the monarchy and made France a republic, and then executed the monarch to really drive the point home, before eventually the restoration of a monarch, but with a constitution after the fall of Napoleon in 1815. There was also changes to the social order, which means that privileges for members of the church and members of the noble classes, many of those privileges were abolished, revoked during the revolutions. There was also a social change. So when you're reading about the French Revolution, you want to look for what changed, what stayed the same, and that's both in the government and in the social order. The French Revolution brought many Enlightenment values into play, and you can see that in things like the metric system, which come out of the French Revolution, applying a more rational, the decimal system to everything. So it's, again, overthrowing tradition in favor of something more rational. So the metric system is one good example to keep track of that. But the French Revolution also involved a fair amount of crowd violence. You can see this huge crowd here that's shown showed up to see, the execution of the king. And a lot of people, there's a lot of sort of bloody street violence that's part of this too. So when you're learning about these events, there is this Enlightenment, legal change, philosophical debates that are happening. And there's also, severed heads being held aloft on pikes, which are long, pointy sticks. So you kind of have both things. You want to keep track of both. The name Napoleon Bonaparte will come up here, and there's a lot of details, of course, to this story. But the thing to know about Napoleon is that he preserved the social changes of the French Revolution, or at least many of them, rolling back some of the gains made by women during the French Revolution, but maintaining gains made by men without property. So that way, maybe like a little bit like a French Andrew Jackson, if you will. He also, though, tried to reinstate slavery in the French colony of Saint-Domingue in what would become Haiti, which led to Haitian independence. So he has influence here in terms of what's happening in Europe, and then also in the Americas. In addition to the Haitian Revolution, Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808 set off a chain of events that eventually led to independence for many of the Spanish American colonies, countries like Colombia and Mexico and Argentina and Peru and many more. Okay. Napoleon, in the political front, also overturned the Republic and made himself emperor. So for a time, France was an empire in the sense they had an emperor. Okay. You might pause and screenshot this, or in the attached slides, just kind of take a look and see. This is a kind of overview of the stages of the French Revolution. Now, Bentley and Ziegler will kind of summarize this, but as a result, they're going to go through a whole bunch of different changes. And the first, second, and fourth ones I kind of talked through in the last slide. The Directory time period, which was instituted during the month of Thermidor, the Radical Revolution changed the calendar in France. They called the first year of the Republic Year One, and they changed the calendar to something that was, in their mind, more rational. So Thermidor is a month. So you can kind of, but the main part of it is there's a revolution that overthrows the king, and there's a constitutional monarchy, and then there's more revolution, which takes things a lot farther, and eventually the Directory and then Napoleon are reactions back against that. So Napoleon, as you can see, rules as an authoritarian who preserved the social changes of the revolution as they related to social classes. So nobles didn't get their privileges back. The church did not regain property it had lost, but protected. And then he protected patriarchy and property. Okay. Some revolutions led to the creation of new states, and so the American Revolution would be one of those. And then in a world history class, where we assume that many students have some knowledge of the American Revolution, then you should take a closer look at the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution involved the kinds of challenges to the existing French government that the French Revolution had, and it involved the creation of a new country, the way the American Revolution did, and it included a rebellion of slaves led by a free black man named Toussaint Louverture that eventually created a new country that overthrew and eliminated slavery and instituted a new constitution. So Haiti was the first country in the world, the modern world, to ban slavery the way slavery had existed in the modern world, the form of chattel slavery. In the past, even back into ancient times, there's kings and rulers and communities that eliminated slavery, but Haiti is the first country that eliminated slavery in its modern form. Okay, the picture there at the right, by the way, is of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who was the first president of independent Haiti. Toussaint Louverture was actually captured by the French and died in France as part of these revolutionary activities. He's the most famous leader from the revolutionary period, and Dessalines is the leader of independent Haiti. Latin American revolutions bear some resemblance to both of these, and in that they created new countries in the Americas. The most important name to know there is Simón Bolívar, who is a figure that'd be more similar to American leaders like George Washington or John Adams, like a wealthy Creole, meaning a person born in the Americas, but in this case, with European heritage, so kind of like John Adams and George Washington are English Americans. Bolivar would have been from a family that had lived in South America for a long time, but wanted a different government, more rights, and independence. Okay. These Creole elites tended to be the leaders of the revolution, but in Latin America, there tended to be more involvement of formerly enslaved people, people of color, on the side of the revolutionaries, and this created a more liberal, meaning more free, order in the republics after independence than in the United States. So most of these countries abolished slavery much sooner than the United States, certainly sooner than Spain did in its colonies that stayed part of the Spanish Empire, like Cuba, and earlier than France, and just a little bit earlier than Britain. So Creole elites, and so the social class tensions remain in Latin America, but it's a little more complicated than in the U.S. Okay. So when we look at these new ideas that are coming into being, I've already mentioned liberalism, which is kind of the dominant ideology of these revolutions. In its governmental form, it would tend toward democratic republicanism. So a republic means that there is not a monarch and that sovereignty, governing authority is derived from some portion of the people. So a republic can be a pretty narrow part of the population, like in the old Roman Republic that was ruled by a senate where it was a pretty small number of people and there was slave ownership, or it can be amongst an even greater number of people. So the United States is a democratic republic, and the philosophy associated with the most rights for people and voting by the larger number of people during the 1800s in Europe and the Americas would be called democratic republicanism. Conservatism then emerges during this time, initially as an ideology that is opposed to the French Revolution. So again, these words mean something different today because in the European context, conservatism would mean support for legitimate monarchs, noble privileges, and established churches. So like an official church that gets money from the state and then provides ceremonial duties to the state. So like a modern American conservative doesn't really support any of those things. There's no noble class in the United States. This does mean like a literal noble class of people with titles that are hereditary. So you just have to, these are relative concepts and they mean different things in different times and places. But the initial conservative movement is people who are opposed to some of the changes unleashed by the French Revolution. And then what is meant by the noble regime is that established churches, established noble classes, and legitimate monarchs. Now, in an American context, like so in Latin America, there is an established church because the Catholic Church was the official church, and that is still the case after independence. And so the wealthy landowning families from, colonial times in combination with the church and the military, they become the core interest groups that conservatism is defending in Latin America. Right. My nationalism image is gone, so I'm just going to have to ask you to imagine some things. But what nationalism means is that the people are the country. So the people being the country is something that we kind of take for granted. So you think of like, what's Germany? Well, it's where the German people live. But that wasn't the case. So if we think of France as an example, before the French Revolution, France was the land of the French kings, and the people who lived there were subjects of the King of France. So part of what nationalism would be in a French context is a transition from subjects of the King of France to citizens in a French republic. And you can also have citizenship in a constitutional monarchy. So nationalism means that the people, the nation, the group of people, are connected to the state in some way. And that's what you call a nation state. And that those two things converge on a particular piece of territory. And officially, that's called territoriality. It's a fancy word for you kids. You can use that someday. But territoriality means that there's this link between the nation, the group of people, and a state that rules a particular piece of territory. Now, I say this is polymorphous. It can take many forms because this could be liberal. You can see how this is opposed to absolute monarchy, because if the people are the state, well, then that means really there needs to be more than just a monarch that claims authority over them. But it can also become a more conservative force as the 1800s go on, and some of the basic tenets of liberalism, like constitutions and voting, become more accepted in different places. Nationalism then becomes a way that that can also be used to stop other kinds of social change. Most famously, it'd be very socialist or anti-communist, because they'd be saying, well, the nation is all of us together, rich and poor, and we shouldn't be dividing against each other with these other kinds of ideologies. So nationalism can be anything. It can be far right, it can be far left, it can liberate, it can punish, it can oppress, it can free. It's complicated. So just kind of pay attention to that. And you just want to look for examples of where do you see nationalism, people against the nation. Okay. So these liberal and nationalist ideas continue to inspire other revolutions in the Atlantic world. This is especially Europe and the Americas. So the image we see here at the right, which is sometimes associated with the French Revolution, which was in the 1780s and 90s, is actually from the 1830s. And it shows liberty leading the people. So the woman there is Liberty, and she is the personification of liberty. Marianne in France, the the Statue of Liberty, and she's leading the people in a revolution in 1830 against one of the constitutional monarchs of France. This is the same time as the musical and novel Les Miserables. Okay. So we see that one. And then in 1848, there's another series of revolutions around Europe, which are mostly unsuccessful immediately in their objects, but kind of put in motion changes that are pretty much happening by the end of the 1800s. So they're short-term unsuccessful, long-term successful. Okay. And then there's also nationalist revolutions, and that can involve people breaking away from bigger empires to form their own country, or trying to and getting savagely crushed by the Russian military. Didn't go real well. Okay. Ooh, if you want to, on the slides, you can click on this. You can see a description of this painting. Okay. And then finally, you get into the late 1800s, and first of all, it is the golden age of male facial hair. I mean, you can almost braid those mutton chops. It's outstanding. That is William the First, who was the first king of United Germany. So again, new nation states could be formed by, like, say, Greece breaking away from the Ottoman Empire. But nationalism could also bring a bunch of smaller places together into a new unified space, like in this case, Germany here. So we got breakaway, like I just described. Another example there. Or bringing things together. Now, Germany is probably the most significant here because of the role that Germany will play in global conflict in the next century, meaning like the 20th century, starting during this period, but then into World War I. So you can see it's a pretty militaristic deal. So he's the emperor of Germany, but he's all dressed up in this military uniform. He's been well rewarded for his service, as you can see. You can also see here how this is a way that nationalism could be conservative. So here we have nationalism and militarism coming together to try to stifle other kinds of social change. So even though he's a hardcore nationalist, there's also still this powerful, noble group that also controlled the officer corps of the German military that existed in modern Germany. Right. Nationalism could also be used in states that existed for a long time or new states like Germany by by motivating citizens to be more loyal to their government. And this just seems normal to us, but the idea of patriotism or nationalism is a new idea in that sense in history. And it's a way that people were mobilized to serve the state. And then in response, then the state also began to provide different kinds of social services, some of which we still argue about in our politics, and others of which, like public schooling, we sort of take for granted. So in Germany, the first social security system was instituted in Germany, which by most measures was a fairly conservative country, with more power to the monarch and fewer individual rights, more continuing continuity and noble privileges, but did provide kind of a basic level of social insurance to its citizens starting in the 1870s. Um, that's a whole nother kind of thing. But we get this new modern state that encourages citizen loyalty and participation, and then also provides, for citizens at some basic level. Okay. So that's what we have, and that's a long way from the French Revolution. But so what you're looking for here in this chapter is how did things change, and what are kind of what's kind of the relationship between ideas and action and governmental structures? Be like a triangle. All right. So happy reading, and we'll see you soon.